Slavery is often thought of as a tragedy that primarily defined the history of the Americas. But the truth is, the institution of slavery is far older and far more widespread than many imagine. It existed long before the transatlantic slave trade, involving nations and civilizations across the globe. In this video, we'll explore 10 unexpected countries where slavery existed long before America's history of enslavement. Let's start with the birthplace of democracy, ancient Greece. Though it's celebrated for its contributions to philosophy and governance, Greek society rested on the backs of an enslaved labor force. Slavery was ubiquitous in Athens and Sparta, with people enslaved as domestic workers, agricultural laborers, and even skilled artisans. War captives, including men, women, and children, often ended up enslaved. What's surprising is this coexistence of Greek ideas about freedom and liberty alongside their normalized use of enslaved people. Slavery in ancient China dates back at least 3,000 years, yet it's a part of history many overlook. Enslaved individuals were often prisoners of war, criminals, or citizens who fell into debt and were forced to sell themselves or their children into servitude. During the Shang Dynasty, for example, slavery was used to fuel economic growth in agriculture and construction. However, the Chinese concept of slavery evolved over time, becoming less prominent compared to neighboring regions by the medieval era. Spanning several centuries, the Ottoman Empire wasn't only known for its vast territory, but also its massive slave trade. Enslaved people came from all across the empire's borders: Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, and beyond. The enslaved were often used as domestic servants and soldiers. This includes the Janissaries, elite troops who were paradoxically military slaves and highly respected. The Vikings may be famous for their bold raids and high-seas adventures, but one thing they rarely get credit or blame for is their role in slavery. Viking slavery, or thraldom, was a major part of their economy. Thralls were often captured during Viking raids in Ireland, Britain, and other parts of Europe, and forced to work in agriculture or domestic settings. Considering their reputation for freedom-loving independence, the irony of Viking slavery is striking. Now let's jump forward in time. It might seem surprising, but Brazil had slavery long before it became part of the transatlantic slave trade. Indigenous people were enslaved by Portuguese colonizers as early as the 1500s. Brazil's colonial economy was built on forced labor, including sugar plantations and mining. Later, African slavery became the dominant system, lasting until Brazil was one of the last countries in the world to abolish the institution, only in 1888. When we think of ancient Egypt, visions of towering pyramids and sprawling temples often come to mind. But these architectural wonders were made possible in part because of forced labor. Enslaved people in Egypt included war captives and others who were bound to labor for elites. While not all laborers were enslaved, slavery was part of the complex structure that supported Egypt's economic and infrastructure ambitions for millennia. Slavery in India goes back thousands of years, emerging during the Vedic period and continuing through various empires. People could be enslaved for debt or captured in conflicts between kingdoms. The Maurya Empire kept enslaved workers, and even in the Islamic sultanates that followed, slavery was a way of life. A system so integrated that many enslaved people rose to positions of influence due to their skills or loyalty. Here's one you may not have expected: Ireland. Before its people were targeted as indentured servants or enslaved during the colonial era, Ireland itself had a system of slavery tied to its early medieval clans. Some enslaved individuals came through war and raiding, others as punishment for crimes. The Viking presence in Ireland also played a big role in shaping its system of slavery, as captives captured in raids were commonly sold or kept as thralls. The Persian Empire, famously sophisticated in its administration, also openly practiced slavery for centuries. Enslaved individuals worked in agriculture, served the elite, and were sometimes forced into military service. However, Persia also had instances where enslaved people could own property or secure a degree of freedom. Despite its advanced society, slavery was part of the empire's vast social hierarchy. Slavery in Korea may not jump out as readily when thinking of global history, but it was embedded within Korean society for over 1,000 years. Known as Nobi, enslaved individuals lived under a system somewhat different from typical Western slavery, where they could often own property, marry, or be manumitted under certain conditions. Nonetheless, Nobi were a source of labor for aristocrats controlled by harsh legal and social structures. Whether driven by conquest, economics, or social hierarchies, slavery has been a haunting thread woven through human history, touching nearly every corner of the world in different ways. These examples remind us that the institution of slavery wasn't isolated to one place or time. It's a shared global tragedy. And perhaps by learning about these histories, we can better appreciate the urgency of striving for a future free from its lingering shadows.